made the conversion from contractor to salary is that it was interesting that my clinicians had what felt like more openings. We never had a waiting list. We always had a waiting list. So to have actual empty seats was very eye-opening for me. And what I had seen was that for many of our clinicians, unfortunately, when they do not have really skin in the game from the business perspective, we were seeing that those retention numbers were dropping. Okay. So I worked with one of my counselors at the time, Ginger, who you're going to hear me ask you, like, who's your Ginger pretty regularly. Um, and Ginger and I worked together to develop a clinical supervision model that we have now been using for 5 years. So every year we've sort of taken it and taken our team to even our new clinicians through this model, and we've improved it as we've went along. So I'm going to share with you what we do, and then I'm going to answer practical. I'll answer any questions, but what I usually get is like very practical questions, like what does this look like when they're sitting in front of me? Okay. So the biggest thing to think about is that we really have to look at this from our global perspective of like our practice, but then breaking it down for what do these numbers mean for this clinician with where they are at. So I have different expectations of what those numbers tell me whenever I am 3 months in with a new clinician
And being real
versus
one counselor.
versus 1 year in um, with a clinician. Okay. So the biggest piece for you to start thinking about is you really want to look at these as a one clinician at a time, um, especially when we're giving them feedback. Okay. But before we ever get to the point of giving a clinician feedback, you really want to understand what is the entire picture of the numbers you're getting for your practice, which again, you've got a great tool that gives you that. But understanding what those trends are, even within your practice, can be helpful. So, like, what are some of the big things that's happened? Did you lose a scheduler? That could impact maybe what some numbers look like. Did you change a system within your administrative piece? So those are some things that, not that we even need to do anything about them, but we just need to understand that that could be impacting our numbers, especially when we're tracking from like 1 year to the next. Okay, so just sort of have an idea of these are the things that happened this year that could have impacted the system. Okay. Um, the other is to, and again, you guys have got a great system to do this, is to understand one, what are your practice averages? And then what are your individual clinician averages? So we don't want just the hard number, though we do want that. We want to look at those on a percent base as well, because that's going to help you to almost even rank your clinicians. And we're going to talk about why that's important. All right, so let's say now we have our retention numbers. Okay, we know what our practice average is. Okay, we know what each individual clinician's averages are. So each of you may have numbers that are more important to your practice. The ones that we use for our model, that we track, is I look at sessions 1 through 12. Okay, and where they started losing clients. So I want to know how many clients they lost after the intake. Okay, that's one number I want to know. And then I want to know, the other really big number I want to know is how many people drop off after the fourth session. So they never make it into the fifth session. And we include the intake in that. So the first 4 sessions that they're at our office, I want to know those numbers. And then for our practice, we actually track out to like 50 and 60 for not really relevant in this model, but I would say you want to know 12. And then what is your goal for your practice? So for many of you, you may be hitting wanting a retention of 8. You may be wanting a retention of 12 sessions. Um, our retention after we started this model and for the type of therapy we do, our average, I think when I looked at it last was it was at least 20 sessions. It may have been 22. I can't remember. So, but I know, so we on average, when we get a referral, and they come in to the intake, we're going to see them 20 times on average. Okay. That takes into consideration somebody who comes in and comes 2 times and then realizes that they can't pay their copay, or that their insurance wasn't covered. So it includes things like where insurance changes happen. It includes things where people come in and they don't like the therapist, or they come in and they come for a few sessions and they move, or they come in and decide to get a divorce, right? So that's why averages are important. Because when you sit down with your clinician and you start going through this list, they're going to have a whole bunch of excuses is what I'm going to say in my head, excuses about why that client stopped coming. And all of those things are going to be valid for that individual situation. Okay, so that's why it's important knowing those patterns. Okay, if a client, if you have a whole bunch of clients that are stopping after the third session, and they're all saying it's because of insurance issues, well, now you're like, oh, now I got an insurance issue of who's checking my benefits, right? So that gives you really good information for other parts of your system. But in general, you're going to have this list, and those aren't going to actually be most of the reasons why people stopped coming. It's going to be why they told you. Okay. Um, and that's important because when you know your other averages for each of your therapists, everybody's going to have something where the insurance messes up if you've got an insurance problem. But if you're only seeing that with 1 or 2 clinicians, that's going to really clue you in that it's this individual clinician issue. And that's just the excuse they gave. Okay. So let's take, I'm going to take Rashada, one of my therapists. Her numbers were really low. So what happens is I pulled her caseload, and I looked at the clients that stopped coming, that they didn't make it to the to the 5th session. So she had a list, let's say, of 10 people that didn't make it to the 5th session. So I'm going to pull those, and those are the ones that I'm going to start with in my individual supervision with her. And we're going to go through and we're going to look at what is the diagnosis for each of those. We're going to look at what are the treatment goals. We're going to look at demographics. What is their race? What is their sex? What is their age? Because I want to get to see if there's any patterns in those 10 people that dropped off. Okay. So that's the place I'm starting. And then as we look through those patterns, a lot of things will usually come out. One that we will see many times is, and that was the case with this clinician, is she realized looking at that list that she had a bias against a very specific population. Okay. And so that is why it's not just an administrative, let's look at the numbers piece. It's what does this say for me as self as the counselor? Is it that I don't work well with a certain diagnosis because maybe I haven't had enough training or supervision? Okay. So we're going to give a real honest look at those, and break down any patterns that we see. If you just give them their retention number, that is not going to do anything for them except for have them compare where they are with their other teammates when they ask them. Doesn't give them any clinical, because remember, most of our clinicians are not business-minded people, right? That's why they're coming to us. That's why they have trusted us with their careers. And so giving them those numbers is going to fall flat. unless we explain what those numbers really mean. Or it's going to really lower their self-esteem as a clinician because they're going to think, oh, I'm the lowest one on the team, right? What, I must not be good. And so again, we want to help them to see what are the patterns for them clinically because they know clinical things. So that's where we want to meet them. Okay. All right. Any questions about this before I move on? I'm going to, dig deeper, but any questions, anybody's stuck? Hang on, I can't read my chat from here. Let's see here.
Question, I can read it for you if you'd like.
Okay.
Does your EHR have demographics entered as a whole to review overall, or do you have to look at individual charts to obtain that information? This is a question from Vanessa.
So, Vanessa, every electronic record system is different. The one that I use will provide a breakdown of their overall caseload, but it will not have a specific list. So the other piece, I'm glad you asked that because the other piece that I do when I see that I have real issues is I'll take that list and I actually would go through and review the clinical notes because that gives me an idea too of what is happening in the session. Okay. So I may go in and make notes of like, okay, just an example, like why are you using CBT, with a 6-year-old? That prefrontal cortex isn't that's you're missing a whole bunch of stuff. Now, if you're using play therapy CBT as part of your model, okay, maybe we can be on board with that. But so it's like, what are their models? What is the diagnosis? What is the age? Is it that kind of training that they need? Right. So going through the chart can give you an idea of, or maybe you go through and you see that they're doing a whole bunch of worksheets with an 11-year-old, right? Well, okay, I have an issue with that clinically. From our model, we have an issue with that. There's million other ways that you could bring that worksheet into that session that's not going to fall flat when you hit an 11-year-old at 4 o'clock after they've been in school all day. Right. So where are we getting the buy-in? It's those kind of tweaks that whatever your model is, that you as that clinical director or as that owner can go in and give them that feedback. So so ours doesn't give us that. You can't pull it by a list of clients and it give it to you. But remember, we are also maybe only looking at 10 people. If you're going back and doing all time, well, you may have a whole bunch of these. If you're going back and doing 6 months, you hopefully don't have a whole bunch. So it may be more reasonable, or you spot check them and do half the list. But it's something that I would definitely do myself. And I can have the clinician do it and let them see what patterns they see, and then we can compare. That way they're coming in with like, oh, I see now part of the problem, right? They can bring the bad news per se. And from the supervision standpoint, that can sometimes get their buy-in a little quicker too. Any other questions in the chat?
The next one from Ashley Brown is perhaps just teeing up your next section. What do you do with the information when you do find these themes?
Yes. Thank you, Ashley Brown. Absolutely. So what do I do? The first thing I do, well, when I look at those numbers, if they're dropping people after the intake, they are usually the ones I'm pulling in first. Okay. Because when we think about what we know clinically, when most people come in, right, they are needing relief. And so they're usually ready to do some level of work. So when they don't come back after the intake, we usually know that there's a couple of skills that are missing or could be missing. So the first thing is I want them to walk me through what they do as part of their intake process from start to finish. Okay. I may even have them role play some stuff. And then I'll see what that may be missing. Now, depending on your model, A couple of things here. One is you may not have any kind of expectation of what they're doing in an intake. You may have just sent them in and said, do your intake. Okay. So if that's your approach, and for contractors, many times that is, there's no telling what they're doing. Okay. And I have seen it all throughout the years. And I'm sure that you guys have too. You've heard stories. So understand what they're doing. And then the other is if you have a system, right, you're going to go ahead and use those moments to teach them how you want it done. If you don't have a system, I would encourage you to get one. We actually, whenever we do this training for individual companies, we help them develop a protocol for sessions 1 through 4. Doesn't really matter much of what model you're using for, I would say 80% of the time, your sessions 1 through 4 should be pretty close for all your clinicians. Okay. Depending on what model you're using, that can definitely shift after those sessions. So understand what they're doing. Mistakes that we have seen that we've had to do coaching on our team is one is coming in and being super scattered. Okay. We treat session 1 like an emergency room visit. People are coming in, and when you go to the emergency room, what do you need? You need relief, right? That doctor's going to come in, they're going to assess where you're in pain. They're going to, get a history to make sure that they're not going to do anything that's going to really mess you up, and they're going to give you some relief. We look at that emergency room model as our first session. Yes, we've got history to get, but we want them to leave with some kind of relief, just so that they can see, okay, this is going to help, because that's what's going to have them come back. And I'm not going to be insecure or abstract about how that relief is going to look. I'm going to say, okay, these are the things that I'm going to need you to do this week. And then we're going to come back next week, and this is what we're going to do next. So there's no ambiguity. It's not like they're looking at me and they're like, this lady don't know what she's doing. So a lot of times when your clinicians come in on 2 wheels, right, they don't know where their pen is. They have to go track down a release. So those kinds of things, and we've all done it. I mean, they come in, they sit down, they're like, oh, hang on, I gotta go get my coffee. And they go back and get their coffee, right? Thinking about an emergency room doctor did that. If he came in looking for his pen, if he couldn't find his stethoscope, right? If he couldn't, if that was his norm way of being, your confidence in that emergency room doctor is going to go way down. And so that's the thing that they need. They need to come in organized. The next is that they need to come in knowing that they are the expert in the room. They may not be the expert on that client's individual situation, but they are the expert, the mental health expert in the room. So if you're working with a lot of new clinicians, they may come in speaking very unsure. So work with them on their delivery of, hey, this is how I'm going to help you. Right. And I may not understand your exact situation, and we're going to take time for me to understand the details, but I understand anxiety, right? I understand depression, and we know how to treat that. So this is what we're going to start with. So teaching them that confidence, having them role play that over and over and over, give them exposure therapy, basically, so that their anxiety can go down. Because we know from the neuroscience of, even mirror neurons, right? If they go in and they're a hot mess, that's going to ramp up that client very quickly. We want them to come in and be the co-regulator. Okay. So understand what's happening and then start making plans to fix that intake process. Staff new intakes as they're added to the tracking. So you may come in and you may try this model and you're like, okay, I'm going to look at the last 3 months or 6 months. How many new intakes did you get in the last 6 months, and how many of them, where did they drop off, right? Now I got a new case. We're not going to wait. We're going to start staffing that new case We're going to add it to our tracker of wherever we're trying to push them to. So maybe a bunch are being lost at intake, and our goal is for them to just not drop anybody after intake. That's goal number one. And then we're going to work on not dropping anybody after the next session, right? So get your new intakes, get them added to your list immediately. Talk about what went well, talk about what didn't. Practice those skills. Okay. So we're going to be doing that. And as that number gets pushed, we're going to then work on the second session of skills. Okay. And so the second session, we're going to focus on things like if we have to focus on rapport building, then we will. Most of the time, well, let me go back to the first intake piece. The other issue that we see once we go through, are they presenting themselves as an expert? Are they helping giving them relief? Is sometimes it's a personality issue. Okay. That is the hard conversation to have whenever you have to say, yeah, people just come in and you're too much. Okay. I got a clinician who it is a personality issue. Either they love her or they're like, I can't do therapy. Okay. So knowing those that have those strong personalities, helping them to understand social cues when that's not going to fly and they need to ramp that in. Okay. And then that goes to a lot of role playing and coaching because we're talking about pieces of who we are, and we have to go in and be able to check that and sort of humble ourselves, right? And be like, okay, I need to meet this client where they're at, and if I come on super strong, I'm going to lose them. Some this is where people start getting mad at me, so y'all just feel free to. Some people do not, right? Those first impressions are really rough. And we have some clinicians who are very inward focused at times. They're oversharing. The intake is not time. I would really say most any session is not time for a lot of self-disclosure. Your client doesn't need to know that you have anxiety and what your symptoms are, right? That's not the place for that, especially in the first session. So understanding is your clinician oversharing as a way of trying to build rapport, and they don't really understand how to build rapport and confidence. Okay, that's another clinical issue that we see. So we're going to track our new intakes. Then we're going to develop the what's next skills. If you're seeing that you have a high number dropping off at session 1, but you also have a high number session 2, okay, well, we got to give them session 2 skills. And that's the same for 3 and 4. So what we see for session 1 through 4, 1 with your intake, but that 3 through 4 is giving them enough skills to help them, 1, feel like they're not in crisis, but 2, to understand that it can't just be a Band-Aid fix. Okay. Now, if you are short-term therapy, you're probably not on this call because you guys are probably, wanting to hit, 10 or 12 sessions on your retention. And so, again, we're not Band-Aid fixing things. We will help stop the bleeding, but we want to get really down to what the core is. So how do we stabilize the system and then move into the next step of whatever your model is, to give them the skills to go deeper? We're going to follow those same set of clients through. We may not spend sessions every time with those same clients, in detail, but we're going to hit that same 10 I started with, and I want to push those all the way through to whatever my retention model is, my goal is. Okay.
Ashley, if you don't mind if I jump in real quick, I just want to
Absolutely.
clarify one thing that I think a lot of our Practice Vital users may do short-term therapy. I actually do in my practice. We're more behavioral.
Mhm.
But with 8 as a minimum, I mean, we're still talking like it still takes 12, 15 sessions to get there, even in the shortest term therapy approaches. So I think when we talk about retention, we're really talking about everybody. You might be talking about longer term retention, but even getting to that minimum mark is a struggle for a lot of clinicians and a lot of the users that we help are seeing it even a struggle to get to the eighth session. So I think it's relevant regardless of their
Okay.
approach.
Yeah. Thank you, Tori. That's super
Sure.
helpful because, what we see is the reason I think that 4 is that magic drop off for a lot of people is because usually within those first 4 sessions, you're stabilizing, right? They've stabilized. They've gotten just enough skills to feel some relief, but they don't have enough practice at it with feedback. So also teaching your client, like, this is what you can expect. You're going to get some relief today, but at session 4, you're going to feel a lot better. But that is really us just putting a Band-Aid on a really deep wound. Because you have felt seen and heard, you're going to already naturally feel better. Okay. Sometimes I want to say, if you would have just told your best friend this information, you probably would have felt half as good. Like you didn't get some skills, but you got heard. Okay, what happens at the 4th and 5th is that they feel heard and seen, and so they're like, oh, okay, I'm better. So I always teach my people, hey, this is where actually you feel safe with me. You've got some coping skills, and your head's a little clearer, right? You're feeling a little better. That is actually when the hard work begins. So I'm going to need for you to show up at session 5 ready to work, because that is where we're really going to dig down, because your confidence is better. You're feeling better. You're sleeping a little bit better, right? And now you've got some energy. That is actually the energy we need to channel into making you better for the long term so we can stop these patterns, right? So it's having even that conversation with sometimes it's with your clinicians to help them explain what's going on. But with the client, having them model that in session with you and then go in and do it with their clients. Okay. So for us, our first session, ER model intake, our session 2, 3, sometimes 4, we actually pull a lot from Bruce Perry's neuroscience stuff. If you're not familiar with any of his stuff, I would start by just recommending you read the book that he did with Oprah. He did a book with Oprah called What Happened to You. It's a very general public read. Alyssa, yeah, he is the best ever. Him and Oprah, the audio book is great because it's Oprah. But get the hard copy because there's some graphs in there. We used that model to base a lot of our first 1 through 4 sessions. Okay. We do a trauma timeline. The reason we do that, and we don't stop until we finish the trauma timeline. The reason is we have seen this in our practice, and the research is supporting this, is that when they can make it through the trauma timeline, and we're not going into super detail, we're just helping them to see, okay, we get a bigger picture of what compounds experiences we've had this led up to this depression, this led up to this anxiety. We're going to want to do that all at once, because at the point where they finish that stress cycle, their sleep is already going to get better. I don't want to prolong that. I want to get them to that sleep as soon as possible, because most of your clients, and if you look at the DSM, like I think the percentage was like 70 something, I'll pull it and email it to you guys, of diagnosable issues in mental health, like a high percent of them all have an issue with sleep. And so if we can help get that sleep better, everything's going to start functioning better. Okay. So that is typically our 1 through 4. We're also in that 1 through 4, we're going to do what does Ginger call it? Tigers and spears. It is very much about anxiety. It's about problem solving, even. Peter Levine is the one who wrote a book, but we're just going to teach that method and that understanding of the neuroscience of anxiety. Now, you may in your practice never touch anxiety. Maybe that's not going to be relevant. It is for most of our practices. But again, we're going to give them some of that neuroscience to help them understand what's happening in their body. And then we're going to give them some small changes to make. So we have the intake, we have the tigers and spears, and then we have the trauma timeline. And again, it doesn't have to be called a trauma timeline because maybe they don't think there's any trauma. But what we're going to be able to see is, okay, from year to year in those chunks, maybe what's being pushed forward to the present. Okay. So we have that. Just to touch base on a few other things that may be helpful. We see the next drop off usually at session 8. Okay. And again, that depends on your model. 8 may be where you're trying to get. If you're trying to get to 8, then that 1 through 4 is going to really push you there. I would be wanting to know how many are really dropping off at 1 and how many are really dropping off with 4, because you probably don't have a 5, 6, 7 issue. You probably have a 1 through 4 issue. Okay. But if you're already at 8 and you're wanting to push through 12, one of the things that's been as helpful for us is to look at what your caseload is made up of and make sure that, I mean, we're a lot of depression and anxiety. If that clinician doesn't have any evidence-based practices, and we're really seeing CBT as very helpful, but even deeper models, if there's trauma, get them that information or have them get that information. And that can help them push and give them those deeper skills to get to 12. Okay. A book I would recommend if you work with depression, I have all of my clinicians read this book out of the gate. It is such an old book. I'm going to tell my age in this one, but it is Feeling Good by Dr. Burns. And he's put out a couple of other after, which I have, and they're good. But it is very CBT focused. I am not a CBT therapist, but I love that book. And it has so many practical things. So that may be a resource if you're not familiar with it, that's worth looking into if that fits your population as well. So any questions before I talk about my possum here?
One quick question in the chat, just real quick. I'm intrigued by your opossum. In Practice Vital, is the retention rate different from churn rate, 4 sessions, or does it include churn? Does that make sense? Samantha, thank you. So consider churn and retention in Practice Vital to be sort of companion metrics, tracking your progress towards longer term retention. Churn is going to indicate how many or what percentage of clients have dropped off before making it past that 4th session. Retention will be looking at that same population and seeing how many of those clients have made it to 8 sessions or more. So consider them companion metrics, tracking the 2 drop-off points or milestones, if you will, in that path towards longer term retention.
Yeah, understanding what your numbers are telling you is so important, because when you go to them, you're going to need to be ready to really explain it to them, because they are going to get defensive. When you have a clinician that's been practicing for 30 years and their numbers are really, like, when they're ranking really low, those are tough conversations. The first time we did this and we started tracking, I made a couple of mistakes. One was I didn't wait until I had all the data. So I didn't really understand the data. And I didn't think my first handfuls, I was like, man, like this is not good, right? Um, yeah, they were actually pretty average. Okay. So know what your ranking is. Like, put yourself in there if you're seeing clinicians, and list out. I list out my rankings, like who is my best therapist, and I go down the list who is my worst. Um, and this is sort of another conversation, but also, where are you wanting them to be? But what is also realistic within your practice with your model? Um, and at what point are you like, is it you're losing money and you have to have that conversation of you've got to get better or you've got to go. Um, being able to this is the piece that I love about this. Being able to take the numbers that they give you, understanding them, but being able to tie it back to why is it clinically important? Because your clinicians are going to come back at you with all you care about is money. Okay. If you haven't heard it, when you start having these conversations, you're going to hear it. All you care about is money. This, when you make it about the clinical perspective, it helps them to go to the thing that they know. I'm in this field to help people, and you're telling me how to better help people. Okay. Um, the thing that I also made is that I gave them their rankings, not with names. I just said, hey, I do give company averages. I say this is the average for the company, and this is what yours is. Okay. I don't give the highest and I don't give the lowest. I made that mistake the first time because I thought, oh, transparency and people want all the numbers. They can't handle all the numbers. And so they will get their feelings hurt, and you will have people who leave. And so that kind of stuff, hopefully you can learn from my mistakes. If you want to give those, I would easily give that information just so that you don't have a mass exiting. The other is don't set the goal too high. Like if I've got somebody and they're averaging, 8 sessions a referral, and I tell them that the company average is 20, that's already tough enough. But, if I tell them that, Leah is averaging, 38, right? That's really disheartening. So I don't even need that information doesn't need to be given to that person. Okay. Um, what you will see when you come to them with these numbers is that they will go through what I call the fight, flight, possum situation. They generally will show up with one of these, right? Because they feel like they're being attacked. No matter how well you frame it, that's going to be the case. They're going to get really defensive. Then they're going to some of them are going to run, but then you're going to have some of them who are going to do the whole possum thing. And I don't know if any of y'all live in the South and you know what possums do, but when possums get scared, they roll over and pretend to be dead. Okay. And that is what some of them are going to do. They're going to freeze and they're not going to be able to do anything. And it's not even a response, right, of defiance. It's just their central nervous system. So again, knowing that going in, you can help prepare them, and just give them a small thing. Like I don't have to tell them my whole supervision plan for them. All I can say is, hey, we've got these numbers and we're going to work on this. Today, we're working on your intake session. Right. I don't need to talk about what's happening in session 4 and session 8 and 12 because it may be irrelevant. You may never get the clients there. Start where your starting point is. And then as you get to it, give them that information. Okay. All right. Thoughts, questions? There's never enough time. Okay, so things I found, I talked about some of these. Understand what your data is telling you before you talk to them. Sometimes less is more. We talked about that with the feedback. Be prepared to lose some clinicians. People say they love feedback. I'm going to tell you, they do not like these numbers. If they're not good, they do not like them, because it is like the numbers are what they are. Like, and so, be prepared. It may be that you aren't in a place where you want to do that. It may be that you're losing money, and you're like, when you really do the numbers, like, you're you are losing money. We did this on one clinician for a practice, and when they talked about the cost of referral, that clinician was costing the company, I think she said it was like $23,000, $24,000 a year, when they looked at actually how much they were spending on your marketing costs to keep that clinician full. So, you probably actually want to lose those clinicians. That's a big gap. You're not going to have a lot of those, but you are going to have some that pop up from time to time. Then let's talk about the supervision piece. So just real quick, I have at this point, a full-time clinical supervisor. That position for us, she started slowly. So she took like 10 hours a week and committed it to supervision while we built this model. It took her, once we realized how much money we were actually saving by putting her in this model and doing it, at year 2, I moved her full time to that position. She only sees clients, like she may see 6 a month of hers that have come back throughout the years for checkup. That position pays for itself every year. And the cost, we were calculating it on one clinician. And again, we're at a higher, we're billing, and retention is, like 20 sessions. We increased that clinician sessions, I think, by like 7 or 8 recessions. And it was like 20 something $1,000 more we brought in on her. So if you think about that over years and over multiple clinicians, you can pay for this position. Like, it really is realistic that you can start by moving on part-time, if you don't have somebody in that role yet. But you've got to make sure that your clinical supervisor has time to stay ahead of the curve. Like, they need to be able to read those books before they show up, right? They need to have some time to do that. You may want to send them to some, instead of sending my whole team to the really fancy training, the trainer by the person who created it, I'm going to send my clinical director. Because I can't afford to send a whole bunch of people to, that workshop or whatever, but I can afford to send her, and then it trickle down. Okay. Okay. Y'all may have a lot of questions. I know we've got like 10 minutes left, and some of y'all may have sessions. Talk to me a little bit about what your thoughts are, what your fears are.
We have a couple questions in the chat, and feel free if anyone would like to, speak to these more directly. But one from Ashley, and she's referring to, how we use Practice Vital. We look at retention over set chunks of time, right? So either last quarter, last 12 months, this year to date, et cetera. As you're reviewing retention for your practice, what is the typical timeline that you would be looking at that feels like it's giving you a good barometer for that person's retention numbers?
So if they're new, I don't really even deal with that as much. As if they're new, I'm really focusing on the tracking from the first session. Okay. So we're going to bring every new person that added until they sort of establish that caseload. And then I'm just going to shove it forward 1 through 4. I'm not even looking ahead. Now, once, I would say 6 months of data is good to give you. So for us, it gave us some good patterns. The advantage of looking at it from session to session, like, ours is tracked and we can see, is this percent going up? Is this percent going, up, down, whatever, is that if you're making changes in the system and you're taking numbers over 6 months or a year, it takes a lot of momentum for those to start shifting, those percentages to shift. So that number may go up very little until they gain momentum, and they're going to get discouraged. So I if they've been with me for a couple of years, I'm going to run retention on 6 months.
Mhm.
Okay. The first time I ever did it, when I realized I may have a problem, I actually did the entire history. It took me forever. And I said, okay, your all-time career with Garrett Counseling, this is your numbers. And then this is your numbers for the last year.
Mhm.
Okay. And if those numbers looked weird, then we had a discussion about what that meant. But if I had a model, if I had a tool like this, knowing what I know on this end, I would probably run a 6 months. And then I would want to pay attention to whatever my target area was that we had the issue, so that I could see, okay, where are we? How much more is making it to 12 sessions, or how much more is making it to 8? Um, because they can see real change at that point. You only dropped. You had 3 people who didn't come back after an intake in the last 3 months, compared to the 3 months before we started. You had this many. So yeah, I don't think it has to be a huge history, because you're not, especially as you start working, because they're going to see small changes, and it's going to feel like they're being defeated. So
That's
yeah.
great. Yeah, thank you. And I think hopefully, Ashley, that answers your question, Ashley Brown, that is. I think, what I'm hearing is maybe a starting point like 6 months or a year, depending on the history of your practice and depending on the history of your clinicians and how recently they've
Mhm.
started. Using that as the starting point, but then using the context for any individual person, to maybe refine that search or filter to get to more answers. So, you mentioned in your chat too, Ashley Brown, that, you might see some dramatic or drastic differences in those numbers. Remember to look at, in our tool, you can always see how many intakes were included in that retention number to really get a sense for, okay, if we're only talking about a handful, so it looks like, 1 out of 2 clients were retained, that's a 50% retention. That context gives you a little bit more of that informed lens to say, okay, let's just look at this a little differently now, right? Or drill
Yes.
into those 2 or 3 intakes and understand why on a more specific level, instead of just taking that number for
Mhm.
what it is, right? Um,
Because the other issue that you see is, which you don't catch unless you really break it down session by session. That's the piece that a lot of people have been missing. They look at the overall number.
mhm,
Well, what happens when you've got a clinician who stays full? Okay. And I see this all the time. Um, and you're not watching how many intakes they get. Well, if we're at my practice, we have a waiting list of 100 deep at each office location at any given time. Referrals is not our problem. But if a clinician and they're billing and they're making, for them, they're bringing home 80 grand, 90 grand a year, because they're always full. But I gave them, right, 100 referrals, right? uh, you've got an issue, right? And so if you just look at the one number and think, oh, hey, they're a big money maker for me. That's what I hear. Well, they're a big money maker for me. Are they? Like, how much did you spend in marketing this year? And if you're spending money to get those referrals, you need to know how much that each referral costs you, because that's going to really tell you how much money they're making for you. Right. So
good.
you can't just look at that one in that one context. You got to look at how much is it really costing you to get that, 150 grand that they made you.
Mhm. That's great. That's great. Related to that intake flow and that process, Vanessa's question here is, could you expand a little bit on how you're assigning intakes? Are you looking at retention rates of your clinicians when you're assigning folks new intakes, or is it exclusively based on interest and niche and sort of availability?
Well, this is going to depend on how your practice set up, and you probably have very strong opinions about this. So, all my people are salary. Most all of my people are generalist, but they have their extra area of expertise. Okay. So, if first of all, if a client, it depends on what the client wants. If a client calls and most all the time, they're going to want the thing they care about is using their insurance. Okay. So, that's usually our first factor. And then they're usually going to care about time of the day for appointment that works in their schedule. And then they're going to care about the gender of the client, of the counselor. Those are usually the things that matter to our clients. And I can say, and we do, I've got this clinician and I hear you're telling me blah, blah, blah. And they are really good with, what you're talking about. If they don't take their insurance and they don't fit their schedule, they're not taking them. So when I filter out all that, do I consider retention? If I am a contracting based practice, yes, because I am working hard and I have a referral issue. Yes, because I'm working hard to get those referrals. I want to give them to the people who are going to do the most with them. Okay. From the business perspective, let's push aside all the clinical stuff. If I am in a practice where it's salary and it doesn't matter, am I going to look at retention? Yes, because I want to make the most of every referral I get. The issue becomes, right, when all those people are full, right, what do I have? I've got my people whose retention isn't as good. What giving the people who are really good at it the referrals does for you is it may open up a few more slots on my struggle people, my people who are struggling on their schedule, where I'm going to put them with that clinical supervisor. So I'm going to use those availabilities as they come open. You need to be with the supervisor more because you can't keep your caseload full. So we're going to put you with Ginger. And Ginger does individual, she does small groups, right? It depends on what we need. She can group people together. And this is for that remediation piece, but once you start bringing on people and you've got somebody in this role, now you're onboarding people with the model that works for your practice. So your new people, and this is what kills people when we first did this, the people who called it at the time when we had that model down, and we brought them on board, their numbers were better than the people who had been with us for a long time who hadn't went through that same training. So at some point, you're going to want to catch your people up, right, and fill in those gaps to maximize what you got happening with your oldies, right? And you don't want to necessarily get rid of your oldies, right? People who've been with you for a while, because this is where you have to decide what your priorities are. If they're good enough, but they're not the best, what other value are they adding to the practice? Because again, we're just talking about retention here. But, I've got a person whose retention hangs out around 12, which is low for us. But she brings a whole bunch of other history, company culture, and value. So for me, it's worth having her there because she is bringing some more value that maybe doesn't have a price tag on it, but I know brings value for the company culture and the history of the culture of the company. So you get your numbers and then you got to really sit and think about them. And that's going to look different for each practice. I hope this is helpful, guys. Yeah.
This has been fantastic, Ashley. Thank you so much. I know we're coming up on time. I just want to, for the group, recap, at least in my mind, the biggest takeaways are, as you've said, like getting to know your numbers through Practice Vital for the audience here today and looking at churn and retention in tandem to one another to start as your starting point for where do you need to identify those issues, who do you need to lean into and have more thoughtful diagnosis of their caseloads and where those drop-off points are happening. That can be your starting point, and then digging in on a more clinical basis with them. And then the other big takeaway that I loved was just formalizing that 1 to 4 session protocol for your practice can be a really smart starting point or takeaway for this group of, how do you define the expectations from intake through 4th session very clearly for your group, whether that's drawing on certain models you mentioned, like the trauma timeline, et cetera, but really having a very set expectation for your staff for those first 4 sessions seems like a really great first step to help in improving those numbers too. So thank you so much for this conversation. Like I said, we'll share this recording out to the group via email, and Ashley, feel free to chime in with some of those specific book references you mentioned. I think this group would really love those. And thank you so much for everyone's time. Feel free to shoot any other follow-up questions specific to Practice Vital to either Tori or myself this week, and we're happy to answer them. And thank you again, Ashley, for joining us. We really loved your perspective today.
Thanks, guys. I hope you'll have a good week.
Thank you. You too.